4. Nobles and builders, the sacking of the heart.
Morning did not break that day. It tore. It was a violent rupture in the fabric of the sky, a gray bleeding of light that revealed a landscape already occupied. The air above Kazanchis was heavy with a premonition of dust long before the first hammer struck the first stone. Nahom had risen early, compelled by the same internal clock that had governed the colonel, the clock of the sun and the duty to the soil. But when he stepped across the threshold of 647, the lane he had known since his first breath was no longer a lane. It was a staging ground for a war disguised as progress. Trucks, vast and yellow like mechanical locusts, stood where children once played. Men in yellow vests, their faces masked by the anonymity of bureaucracy, measured the air with cold, laser-focused eyes. "Development," one officer said, his voice flat, as if he were explaining a seasonal weather pattern rather than the annihilation of a dynasty. The sound came next, a low guttural growl that started in the belly of the machines and vibrated through the soles of the people's feet. It was the metallic cough of the first excavator, like an ancient beast waking up to feed. The earth itself seemed to flinch, a tectonic shudder that ran through the foundations of 647. Nahom watched them roll forward, and for a moment, the oxygen left the world. He wanted to shout, to stop time with the sheer force of his will, to summon the ghosts of the emperor, the colonel, the Ras Imris, and the Fitawaris to stand as a spectral wall against the steel. But only his pulse answered, drumming a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The cross at the doorway. Ayaya was already in the courtyard, her movements a tragic ballet of necessity, tying up the soot-stained cooking pots that had fed 3 generations. Her hands, usually so steady, were trembling with a fine electric palsy.
"They said we'd have until next week,"
she whispered, her voice a fragile thread.
"They lied."
Betty stood beside the doorway, and in that moment, she was no longer a woman, but a monument. She blocked the entrance with her body, her arms stretched wide like a cross, a living crucifix of resistance.
"You'll have to go through me,"
she told the men. Her voice, unshaken, had the resonance of a bell tolling for a funeral. Behind her in the dim light sat Wosini on the old sofa. It was the same sofa that had held 60 years of her evenings, the same fabric that had absorbed the colonel's laughter and the children's secrets. She sat with her shawl pulled tight, her eyes fixed on the ceiling as if she could see Teferitin there, standing guard in the rafters. The men ignored them. To the machines, a human body is merely a soft obstacle. A hand was raised. The bucket of the excavator lifted, silhouetted against the pale sun like a guillotine.
"Please,"
said Nahom to the nearest officer, his voice cracking with the weight of a century.
"There are memories here. There are revered places of birth. There are sacred graves here. This is the heart of hearts."
The officer would not meet his eyes. To look at Nahom was to acknowledge the humanity of the victim, a luxury the corridor plan did not afford.
"Orders," he muttered, a word that has served as a shield for every tragedy in history.
Death of the Jasmine.
The first blow did not strike the main structure. It struck the veranda, where the jasmine vine had climbed for decades, perfuming the debates of the heart's parliament. The sound was not the mechanical crunch of brick and ceramic breaking. It was the sound of breath leaving a body. It was a wheeze of collapsing timber. The vine fell in slow motion, its green leaves and white petals scattering across the courtyard like confetti from a cruel and hollow celebration. Inside, the colonel's photograph of him in his full uniform, eyes clear and judging, slipped from the wall. Betty screamed then, a sound that ripped through the mechanical roar, a scream not of fear, but of absolute ancestral fury.
This house raised half the city,
She cried, her voice reaching the ears of the workers who tried to look away.
It fed your mothers. It sheltered your uncles. You eat the bread of our soil and you call this development? You dare dismantle the altar and call it progress?
"40 Nights of Fire."
Nahom ran into the back rooms as the walls began to groan and dragged out what he could: the old radio, the wooden stool of the elders, Shiambel Johannes Araya's yellow chair, and the 60-year-old sofa. He threw each in turn into the alley, his hands bleeding from splinters, his lungs burning with the pulverized history of his home. Behind him, the walls fell in waves, a slow-motion erasure of the royal Kazanchizian legacy. And it was done. The machines stilled, the destroyers left, and only remained a heavy silence with just smoke, dust, and the scent of crushed jasmine. Nahom stood still amid the wreckage until nightfall. The neighborhood was unrecognizable. It had become a flat plain of rubble, a graveyard of ghosts where the metallic glint of nails caught the moonlight. He gathered wood from the debris, the broken ribs of his own home, and built a fire. The wind was a blade slicing through his thin jacket, so he crawled close to the flames. The smoke stung his eyes, the heat licked his skin until he had to roll away. Then he shivered in the cold until he crawled back again. This became the liturgy of his survival. Burn, shiver, move, repeat. He slept that way for 40 nights. 40 nights guarding the ashes of a kingdom. The city lights of the new Addis blinking in the distance, glass towers of banks and hotels, indifferent to those left on rubble. Stray dogs circled guarding him. They knew the scent of belonging. Once, his foot brushed against a nail jutting from the earth. It should have pierced him deep, but it merely grazed him. Even destroyed, the home protected her son. Each dawn brought the task force, police with batons and sticks, men from Prosperity Party, officials from the Werada Wereda, asking questions they never meant to answer. They threatened, mocked, and sometimes laughed. They even burnt the old sofa Nahom had dragged out, his last link to Waseni's warmth, claiming it was unsanitary. But they could not burn the clarity that was forming in his mind. Hunger turned the hours elastic, and in that stretching of time, he heard the deeper heartbeat of the land. Something in him just would not die. Maybe it was the stubbornness of Kazanchis herself, too proud to kneel even to kings. Maybe it was the echo of the colonel's voice.
"A man's honor is the last fortress to fall."
"Where is Ethiopia's heart now?" he whispered into the dust. "If not here, then where?" He looked around at the wreckage, at the twisted metal, at the broken coffee cups glinting like fallen stars in the dirt.
at the trees and plants they spared, but dried anyways when the people were all taken away, as if their lives went with them. And he felt a pride that was too old for his years.
If they have taken my home,
He said aloud to the empty air.
then I will take my throne. If they can erase Kazanchis from the map, I will rewrite Ethiopia from my blood.
The city around him was silent, but in that silence he felt something ancient stir, like the first breath of dawn over Aksum's ruins. The blood of kings does not vanish. It waits. That night he stood atop the highest pile of rubble and faced the east. His shadow stretched across the flattened ground, long and regal, a silhouette of the colonel himself.
I am Nahom,
He said.
sovereign son of Kazanchis. This land remembers my name, even if your maps don't.
The wind answered, lifting a swirl of dust that shimmered in the moonlight. For a split second, the dust took the shape of a veranda, a jasmine vine, and a man in a polished uniform. Nahom knew then. The story was not over. It was only shifting from the stone to the spirit.
Children of the last tribe.
Before the bulldozers, Kazanchis was a single, breathing organism. She woke to the morning Kidon prayers of her churches, the clatter of tin and the hiss of charcoal. She was a world where the bakers sang soldier songs and the children played between the feet of history. We raced past walls that had seen the return of heroes and the fleeing of fascists. We were the last generation of the heart of hearts. We learned rhythm from the jazz pouring out of Omedla and Asab Keste, Demina, before we learned arithmetic. We were raised by the stories of mothers who told us that Addis was a woman, not a building, that she could be bruised, but she could never be owned.
Nobles and architects. Let us remember the names that the machines tried to bury. Let us remember Ras Imru Haile Selassie, cousin of the emperor, King Geta Yoftahe Niguse, the poet, and Fitaurari Atnaf Seged, the hero of 2 Italian wars. Let us remember Wali Mohammed, the Indian architect who built the first mosque and proved that Addis was a city of many faiths and one heart. Kazanchis was not only the extension of the imperial palaces, but also where the builders who built them lived in. Her nobility was not found in titles, but in the temperament. She was the mixture of Aksumite kings, Oromo patriots, and Amhara scribes that created us. A unique breed. Proud, hospitable, and unafraid. The Ledger of Memory. The city calls it development. They speak of corridors and beautification, but memory keeps a different ledger. They dismantled the body of our neighborhood, but they could not evict the root. I laid on a 60-year-old sofa and listened to the city fold, but the colonel's laughter was the scaffolding of my will. To tell this story is to honor the legacy of Ras Asrate Kasa, Ambassador Abebe Reta, and the small post office that stood its ground. They are the anchors. The Dergs slaughtered the men and took the property. The next government stripped it. The Prosperity Party made us all invisible. But I am Nahom, and I will not let the balance be set to 0. Vigil for the heart of hearts.
After the machines left, The silence was more terrifying than the noise. The neighborhood had been turned into a moonscape. NAHOM sat on the 60-year-old sofa, which sat incongruously in the middle of a field of rubble. He was a king without a castle, a shepherd without a flock. The fire he built from the broken beams of his own bedroom was a holy fire. It was fed by the seasoned wood of his childhood. For 40 nights he existed in a state of burn and shiver. While the city of Addis Ababa continued to glow around him, a neon crown on a head that had forgotten its body. On the 7th night, he found a small, rusted nail in the dirt, a handmade nail from the original construction of 647. He held it in his palm until it grew warm.
You were part of the wall that held my father's portrait. You are more real than the towers they will build.
Sovereignty of the displaced.
To understand the weight of the excavator's blow, one must understand that Kazanchis was not merely a district, but the laboratory where modern Ethiopia was invented. When Emperor Menelik II and Empress Taitu Betul stood upon the heights of Entoto and looked down at the thermal springs of Filwoha, they saw not mere land, they saw a destiny. Kazanchis was the first fruit of that vision. It was here that the first drop of tap water flowed from a metal faucet, a silver miracle in a land of ceramic and clay jugs. It was here that the first bulb flickered to life, chasing away a darkness of millennia with the hum of the first electric grid. The first postal stamp was licked here. The first telephone line crackled with the voices of the first bureaucrats. The first library opened its doors to a generation that had previously known only parchment. When Abba Dagnu, the first ever emperor to master the internal combustion engine, decided to test the very first automobile in Ethiopia, it was the dust of Kazanchis that rose behind his tires. He built the first ring road here, not for commerce, but for the sheer thrill of progress. And most profoundly, it was in Kazanchis that the empire first put on shoes. The emperor made it mandatory for his nobles and officials to wear leather footwear. They walked the streets of Kazanchis, and the army followed, and the people followed. In the heart of hearts, the bare feet of the shepherd became the shod feet of the citizen. Every decree that shaped the nation was first shouted from the Fitbear, the imperial front door, and echoed first in the houses of Kazanchis. To destroy these walls was not urban renewal, it was the amputation of the nation's memory. The corridor plan spoke the language of the future, but it was a future without a face. It was a plan designed in rooms with air conditioning and glass tables, by men who had never walked from Gabriel to Uriel just to feel the pulse of the morning. They humiliated the elders. They dragged mothers to the halls and offered them units that felt like cages. They spoke of sanitation while they burned furniture that held the history of a century. They auctioned the plots to faceless buyers, turning the heart of hearts into a ledger of profit. But NAHOM, standing in the ruins of the parlor, realized that a house is not a building. It is a school of belonging. He began to write on the half-standing walls with a charred piece of wood. He wrote the names of the children: Ea, Nunu, Chombi, Chok, Mamitu, Tedisho, Miazu, Teshi, Kabtish, Bichu, Ewui, Enu, Ewu, Bubu, Tebi, Ainu. He wrote the names of the neighbors: Helu, Segai, Jimmy, Mesfin, Gizachu, Kitila, Asiberetu, Hirut, Ermias, Mamenet, Emama Warki, Wendy Abera, Goliath, David, Kindi, Noah, Ayeti, Curity, Saya, Tanishu, Tinkishu, Kulich, Jean Valjean, Shambel Basha, Tank, Tekeste. He was marking the territory. He was telling the earth that it belonged to them, no matter who held the deed. As the first foundation piles for the new Prosperity Towers were driven into the ground, the sound was like a mechanical heartbeat, cold and steady, each strike feeling like a nail being driven into history. Nahom stood covered in the dust of his ancestors, his stomach empty, but his heart full.
I am Nahom,
He said to the wind.
son of the man who despised bribes, grandson of the shepherd who spoke to the emperor. You have taken the stone, but you cannot take the throne. You have erased the map, but you cannot erase the blood.
He walked through the ruins, all around the center of majestic old Addis. He walked past historic sites diminished to rubble, past the ghosts of great men's homes, past the ministry buildings where the quiet men in suits used to hide their scandalous lives. The city was silent, but in that silence, he felt that ancient feeling stir, the same spirit that built the obelisks and survived the fascist invasion. The story of Kazanchis was not over. It was merely being rewritten in a script that only the unbound could read.
I am Nahom. The land remembers me.